is Edwin K. Morris, and you are about to embark on the next Pioneer Knowledge Services Because You Need to Know, a digital resource for you to listen to folks share their experience and knowledge around the field of knowledge management and nonprofit work. If your company or organization would like to help us continue this mission and sponsor one of our shows, email byntk@pioneer-ks.org.
Hi, my name's Michael Gates. I'm currently talking from where I live in Helsinki, Finland. And that's a place I've been living in for 36 years now. And Finland was just in the news yesterday because for the 6th year running, it's been elected or chosen as the happiest country in the world, which surprises most Finns. I mean, I go out of my front door, bump into neighbours, and they rarely smile or stop to talk. They're very nice people, but they tend not to smile at strangers or initiate conversations. The most interesting thing close to me, and I can't quite see it out of the window, if I was on the top story, I'd probably be able to see it, is the sea, the Baltic Sea. It's currently frozen, or at least it was last time I looked. And if you're driving close to it or walking close to it, you can see people fishing through the ice. They go on the ice until it's almost melted. I wouldn't set foot on it myself. And certainly in some parts of the country, the sea gets so frozen that you even see people driving cars on it. The last book I read was, and I've read it before, was by Pushkin, The Bronze Horseman, which is a poem. It's not his longest poem, that's Eugenie Onegin, but it's a very great poem. And certainly in the current climate, the political climate, thinking about Russia, it gives you a very deep understanding of Russians and their attitude to power. On the one hand, afraid of it, on the other hand, being drawn to it like a magnet, something that I thought I'd reread given the current circumstances.
Michael, you do a lot with work cultures. Do you see that the HR responsibility or the HR role in an organization has totally changed?
I think it has changed. I mean, if you go back, 25 years, I remember being at a HR conference in Budapest. The main theme of the conference was, how can HR have a role which is as respected as the roles of other functions within the organization? You know, what can we do to improve our standing in organizations? Well, I think over the past few years, that's changed a lot. You know, this issue of diversity, equity, inclusion, unconscious bias, those have become issues which HR has taken control of and managed to persuade very senior management that these are, really important things for them to consider and deal with.
So what's the role now? I understand what you're saying, that might have been a squishy concept 25 years ago of exactly where do they fit and how much power or how much domain do they own. As we look to how knowledge is now handled in an organization, those behaviors, those skills of the participants, the employees, whatever level they are, who owns how they operate, how they interface the organization?
Well, I think I would go back to my point that it's something which HR has taken under its wing quite naturally because it's the issues about people. They've been driving this issue, considerably, particularly over the last maybe 10, maybe even fewer years, and pushing those issues up the agenda. Which is quite interesting also from a political point of view. Certainly, I don't know what it's like in the US. In the UK, people some commentators have said, take an organization like the police. They say, well, they spend a lot more time trying to identify, prosecute people who have said something which is not politically correct, for example, with regard to gender, rather than looking after people who've stolen your TV. So there's been a bit of a pushback to it. And it's one of these issues which can be quite polarizing. How do you respond if your organization asks you to put your gender pronouns on your badge or on your email sign-off?
Right. What's the weakest link in that enforcement in a work culture? What do you find is Granted, not all organizations are multicultural or cover multiple regions, but in general, what would you say that organizations really need to pay attention to?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a very important issue. There's no arguing with that. And I think a lot of the development, the things that they've managed to do have been extremely positive. But I think sometimes it may be, I've got to be very careful what I'm saying about it, but sometimes it maybe takes over the agenda to a large degree, removes attention from some of the other things which are important for the business. I'm talking also about, if you think of the company Ben & Jerry's, companies like them have been pushing a political agenda. So buying a particular product is meant in many cases to, give you a particular political positioning. People have argued that should companies really be giving their opinions about political issues, shouldn't they just be selling ice cream?
Well, it's a little of both, right? In a free market,
Yeah.
If you are the owner of the product, then you can basically, within ethical standards, do what you like. I get what you're saying. Where do we go from here, though? We've talked about preliminarily, you and I talked about this, and the language is around the revolution of HR. What exactly has caused that in specific?
I think there's been a general drive towards, diversity and promoting it, and particularly equity. The difference between diversity and equity. Some people say diversity is being invited to the dance and equity is being asked to dance. I think that's how it goes. It's become an increasingly important issue, not just in companies, but in general. I do believe that that's a positive thing. My only question is to what degree it is going to actually help organizations.
What influenced you and who influenced you to find that this essence of caring about work cultures, people relationships, understanding each other, awareness, all those things, where did that come from?
I think it was initially an indirect influence. I studied English literature, and literature is very much about communication, about language, about character, about motivation. Many different things. So although I'm in the cultural field now, I think I was drawn to the cultural field by very much the issue of communication and language initially. My big inspiration there, my mentor, was my tutor at Oxford, who was a wonderful gentleman called Michael Geirin-Tosh. Michael Geirin-Tosh was a brilliant teacher of literature and also a brilliant presentation, getting people to communicate persuasively. For example, for many years, he coached Margaret Thatcher on her speeches. So he was very esteemed in that field. I think he taught me, apart from literature and communication, a way of thinking and of structuring ideas. So, for instance, he always used to advise us when writing. And he had a very unusual, quite aristocratic voice. So I'll try and imitate him. And he would say, "Always put your best idea first, darling." Which, and I think that's quite good advice for anyone presenting in a way. Interestingly, it is culturally loaded. And certainly that approach probably certainly wouldn't work in France, where in France people are taught to structure their ideas. And this applies not just to essays, but the way in which they negotiate, the way in which they do business together and have meetings, is to use Cartesian logic, where you first of all put various premises forward. You decide which one is indubitably true, then you break it down into its separate parts, analyze it, and then finally you bring it all together and synthesize it. So it's a very different approach from put your best idea first, because the French are waiting for a lot more background and context.
Interesting. Is that the main culture that thinks of that differently?
Well, I'm sure there are others that do it as well, and particularly cultures that were influenced by the French. I would put them at one extreme from the point of using a structured, logical approach, whereas other cultures, particularly the Anglo-Saxon cultures, as one example, tend to have a more pragmatic approach. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing about putting your best idea first is probably would go down relatively well in America as well. You start with a wow factor. I mean, you may briefly summarize what you're going to say. You don't spend a long time building up some sort of complicated theory to begin with.
In that presentation concept, experience that I had with the United States Army is the bottom line up front, the bluff. Give me the bottom line up front. They want to know what the juice is up front. You explain it later and solidify it on the back end. And it's very much kind of like the best idea kind of thing where you have to come with the focus first and then fill in behind. The idea of what you're talking about with different cultures having different modus operandi of how they perceive, conceive, process, create thought around language-based products, right? We're talking language is the instrument. Language is the tool that transfers this knowledge or transfers the intent, and it's up to the receiver to perceive that intent from the language tool or the origin. And are we talking about anthropology? I mean, everything that you've talked about is just anthropology, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the roots of different societies in the climate, history, religion, language, and these things affected. I mean, what you've got to be very careful about, and particularly these days, there is also a trend which sort of accompanies, in a way, diversity, equity, inclusion, that you shouldn't pigeonhole or put people in boxes, which is very important as well. You know, there's quite a pushback against the idea of the nation state. Every now and then get people on training courses who say, when I say, well, where are you from? They say, oh, I'm a global citizen. Well, what does that really mean?
What is it?
But what you've got to really bear in mind is that when you are talking about different cultures, you have to use probability. You know, it may not apply in every case, but, you know, say I'm advising you to go and deal with the Japanese. These are the probable ways in which they're likely to react. And probability is something which works out in the long term. Probability is something which gets good results in the long term if you use it. You might not win every battle, but you win the war, to use a military metaphor.
No, I get you. The thing about and we're talking about bias to some degree, either conscious or unconscious, but is there a pendulum swing? And I know you said this a little bit earlier in the discussion about the sensitivity of pronouns and what are we going to focus on here and things like that. Is there a pendulum swing from absolutely no pulse to now we've gone to the other side where everything is hyper effective or hyper sensitive?
I think that's right. And I think we are going through a stage of extreme sensitivity. And this goes hand in hand with, you know, political affiliations and polarization, as you see very much in the US. We see it in the UK. We're seeing it pretty much all over the world, where there is a lot of sensitivity. I suppose my main point about organizations and about diversity and inclusion, maybe you send someone an unconscious bias class and they realize that, oh gosh, I didn't realize I was biased. Okay. You know, what can I do? Well, I can be more sensitive, address people with the pronouns that they like to be addressed with, etc. But if you're thinking from a business point of view, if you've got this massive diversity, whether it be national cultural diversity, gender diversity, you know, all the different sorts of diversity one can have, how are you going to use that? What skills do you need to develop? How can you measure those skills? You know, how do you help people to understand other people better? How do you get people to listen more effectively? You know, people are generally very bad at listening. Some cultures are better than others. You know, if you think globally, what I would term the reactive cultures, the ones who don't initiate, the cultures in the, you know, Eastern Asian countries tend to be better listeners. The problem is that while they're listening, their counterparts are often talking and not listening to them. And I was in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, just before Christmas, and I had a group of young women on it was an award ceremony for young women leaders from Southeast Asia. And I was running a session with them, and I said, you know, discuss at your tables what you think is the thing most misunderstood about your group and about your region. quite a few of them said, people think we don't have anything to say. In fact, we've got a lot to say and a lot to contribute, but we can't get a word in.
Oh, no.
And so, on the one hand, you recognize the diversity, but imagine you're in a company and you've got Asians in the company, East Asians, Southeast Asians.
Yes.
Are you getting the best out of that diversity? Because you don't let them contribute when they've got something to contribute.
I got to push on to where the responsibility of all that awareness, and just in that example you just gave, is that it's up to the leadership to recognize who's got the mic and who doesn't, who's got time to share. And if it's not an equitable approach from the leadership point, you could have an inclusive workforce to a degree, or diverse workforce, but it's up to the middle management and the leadership to make sure that happens.
Absolutely. And, it's got to come from the top. And I think HR could extend their role even further, rather than focusing purely on topics like unconscious bias. How do we recognize the different skills that people can bring to the table?
Yes.
On a simple level of communication, basically, how do we get out of the more quiet participants the very good ideas they've got? How do we stop the ones who are dominating from dominating the whole time? And so it's about communication, about teaching people how to listen. It's all those skills.
So where does those soft skills, who owns that? Because if the HR doesn't drive that, who's it up to?
It is up to HR. It's up to team leaders. It's up to senior leadership to put emphasis on these things. Right. And it's very important to measure. I mean, you take one issue. I was working with an engineering company in the UK a couple of years ago. They had a big event online for a few hundred people who were from Black, Asian, and ethnic minorities within the organization. And the main theme was, why don't these people tend to go as far in their careers in terms of getting seniority in the company than the older white males in the organization? So I'm sure there are many reasons, but one thing that we noticed is that me and my colleagues have been teaching other people in the organization is that although the organization itself as an engineering organization was very linear, I mean, a bit like the army. The army's quite linear, quite structured. The ones who were in really senior positions were what I would term multi-active. So they were putting people issues first. They were more emotional. They were better public speakers. They're more emotionally persuasive. It goes a little bit further, because what's very interesting is that a lot of those minorities, in our research, we found that many of the countries represented by those minorities are actually quite multi-active. So when I was asking, these employees, why do you think you're not showing your natural multi-activity or presumed natural multi-activity at work? They said, oh, well, we feel because we're in a linear organization, we need to be linear. It's torture every day to suppress who we are. Yeah. So my message to them would be, let it out. Bring some of your,
You sound like a counselor.
Let out some of those natural qualities that you've got, because those are the qualities that are at the top of the organization. Don't just sit back. Don't just be fact-based. Use emotion, persuade people.
I mean, you're getting to the essence of what the learning environment has gotten to in the last 20 years, to where they recognize that it's a consumer-based or consumer-centric, it should be a consumer-centric or student-centric model. And that's something that's kind of new in the world of education. So are we talking about organizations becoming employee-centric versus the other way, bottom line-centric, I guess?
I think it's about seeing what natural skills your employees have got and allowing them to use them. And, unconscious bias training, if I go back to that, is aimed very much, quite often at older white males. Try and understand how you are maybe misguided in your perceptions of people who are not like you within the organization. What I would say is that one should also focus on those people who are not older white males, encourage them and give them the skills, or let them, let out their own skills that will help them. Right. So I think the focus can also be not just on saying to the old white males, you're misguided and you're wrong, but saying to the others, you have some fantastic qualities which you're not using. bring out the existing skills that you've got. But you need to measure things first to put people through assessments, etc.
A couple of things here, because in the world of work cultures, there's a sensitivity approach and there's a non-sensitivity approach, and there's a mechanical side and there's a emotional human side to this. And I think the perfect recipe would be that you have to have an expectation of participation and being able to voice. In an organization I used to work in, they had a oops and an ouch policy. So an oops and an ouch policy in general is that you and I are talking and you say something about Army guys. And I'm like, that hurt a little bit. I'm not a flag waver in any regard, but, I did my time. I served. And what you said kind of hurt me a little bit. So I would say, can I interject an ouch here? My job is to inform you there's a little bit of a rub there with your language you just used. You may have been not totally non-intentional, maybe flippant, maybe just trying to be funny or whatever. I do it too. There's some ownership because that awareness piece is not there until somebody makes you aware. And with an oops and ouch policy, the ouch is like, oh, that hurt a little bit. Oops is like, hey, that word is kind of like 30 years ago. It's like it's a reference to something that is, you shouldn't have said that because of this. You may not have been aware of it, so you use the oops or ouch card to just draw awareness. Not to say, hey, that you're wrong. You're not trying to get that accusatory defense up. You're just saying, look, just be more aware.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think simple tools like that can be very powerful. Sometimes when I'm teaching communication and talking about interruption, what I would do is say, look, what do you think it would feel like if someone poked you with their finger hard in the shoulder? Well, that's what an interruption feels like mentally. To try and visualize things and simplify them to some degree.
You're increasing your sensitivity to the environment and the communication style of more than just what's in your head, because there's a program up here that kind of is a running loop. You're anticipating and what you are expecting and what you're not expecting to some degree. Let's move on. I want you, Michael, to explain to me what the definition of knowledge management is, if you would be so kind.
It's not my field, but I would say that collecting knowledge from people who've gone through it before. So, for example, many, many years ago, I was working with an airline who moved people round from different offices every 4 years, rather like the diplomatic service. But what was happening is that, for example, they had someone based in France who wasn't French, and then after 4 years, she or he left, got moved to another country. Someone then was moved to their position in France. Well, during that 4 years, that person had learned a lot about dealing with the French, but they never passed it on. And so what we built for them was a sort of system where they filled in their sort of testament to their time in France and what they'd learned. And that could be very useful for the next person. So they arrive, and not only do they have all the technical information, but they can look at this and see what I've found is that when I'm dealing with the French, in order to get them to agree to things, I need to use logical arguments, Cartesian logic. And the next person comes to go, well, that's really useful for me. I'll try it. So in my field, that would be knowledge management.
That's a perfect example of what that is. That's an awareness piece, right? It's a caring for the next person that's going to fill the seat. Because if that is not there, then you got to start all over again. It's a waste of resources.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, the area which is least looked at is tacit knowledge. Because it's fine, I can look up in this file how this machine works or whatever, that's all written down. But what about that enormous amount of tacit knowledge about dealing with people that can be passed on? And, so I would see it as very important. One final point on this is that in my field in culture, it's in some ways a vague topic because it's all based on perception. So one of the things that I've worked with quite a lot is working with teams where people in the team all do an online questionnaire about how they see themselves. How would I act in this situation? What do I think about risk-taking versus caution, etc.? Do I feel that there's value in making mistakes, or do I see mistakes as a sign of weakness? Now, what's very interesting is that After that, within the team, I'd get everyone in the team to do a mini assessment on each of their colleagues. And then you see the contrast between how you perceived yourself and how others perceived you. So, for example, a while ago, I had a team of different nationality run by a French guy. And the first thing we looked at, he said in his, it came out in his profile that I listen most of the time. Well, when we looked at what his team thought of him, they said he talks most of the time. So what's the reason?
Which is it?
So how does this arise? Well, it's all about perception. And the team said it's because you multitask when we're trying to talk to you. And we feel you're not listening because you're sending a text or something at the same time. Well, in a way, that's quite an easy thing to change. And he made a commitment afterwards and said, look, in future, I'll try not to do it. If I do it, it's fine to just say, stop it. Yeah. You're sort of collecting the knowledge within that unit of how people perceive things. And those perceptions can lead to a lot of disagreement and loss of trust. And they're not real problems, they're pseudo problems.
Exactly, right? It's all down to that perception. Oh, that rubbed me the wrong way. And it just might have been you didn't hear correctly, or the assumption was on your side. And it ends up being a murky waters for a lot of organizations. But I want to get to the fine point of the research and the measurement of. Now, you just brought up the use case. Can you talk to us about Culture Active and how that works?
Yeah, Culture Active is something that was initially developed over 20 years ago. And it came from an idea that I had in Finland when we were assessing people who were going to be chairing EU meetings. The Finnish government asked us to do some sort of cultural assessment of all these 200 or so chair people to see how they would fit in a European context. And it was on paper, it was quite unwieldy, it took a long time to mark. So it initially developed something here, which was originally on CD, then it went online as Culture Active. So what you do is you go into it and you answer questions about your values and beliefs and also about your behavior and communication. They're mainly situational questions. And then it gives you a cultural profile where you appear as, first of all, as a dot on a triangle with three cultural types, bottom left-hand corner, blue, linear active, multi-active, the top, red, yellow, reactive on the bottom right. But then you can drill further and further into it and find out the ways in which you may coincide with other cultures you're dealing with, and also the ways in which you are very different from them. So it gives you advice on how to deal with a particular culture. Now, of course, when you start doing the stuff in teams, you can get a lot more accurate because it's not between you and a different culture, it's between you and a different person. You know, you could be dealing with a French person on your team who is really not typically French at all. Then you find out what are the real challenges between us. And then also with this further assessment for the team, are these correct? Is my self-assessment correct, or am I seen in a different way by others? How am I seen in a different way? Why? And what can we do about it?
So does this tool give you, I understand it gives you that baseline up front, you can see what's happening and gain knowledge deeper to the people and the soft things happening in between the team per se, and give you advice if you're dealing with a culture that is not anything you're familiar with, to give you those cues of how to address, how to communicate. But does it give you longitudinal view? Can the team utilize this to show growth or show patterns of success?
Yeah, they can. I mean, people don't change generally that much in their values, their beliefs, etc. What we're looking for is where you can make positive changes to the way in which you behave with other people. It might not change you as a person. So, for example, you could come out as very talkative, maybe confine that to your home. But at work, the idea is, I know that I'm talkative, I'm perceived as not a good listener. So what do I need to do to make the team work better? Give longer pauses, encourage others to speak, show and indicate that I'm listening. You've not changed as a person, because we're not trying to sort of brainwash people, but what you have done is you've adapted to have some empathy towards others.
And I just want to stress here, even if you could change the efficiency, and I'll use that word, the efficiency of an organization, team, whatever the culture is in its operations, if you can increase that efficiency by 1%, that's a huge change. That is something that can add and continue to grow over time, just by one little degree of change.
Absolutely. You know, the clients that I've got that allow me to spend reasonable amounts of time with them over a period, because this change is a process. When I've asked them what's the reason, they say, well, our financial results have improved in some cases enormously. You know, I'll give you an example. I was working with one company dealing with the French, buying equipment from them, and they wanted to get a 7% discount across the board of all the models of the different equipment that they were buying from them. And the French refused. I said, well, how are you doing this? And it was an Anglo-Saxon culture. They said, well, we're saying, come on, let's just be reasonable. Let's try it on one model for six months.
Let's be reasonable and give us a benefit for what? Yeah, right?
Well, yeah. And so let's just try it with one model. You know, it's not a big risk. But of course, for the French, they want an all-embracing solution. Using this pragmatic approach of let's just try it and see if it works is very un-French. So it's a lot better to actually go in to the meeting and attack the initial premise and say, well, that premise that you've got, you may want to have it as a universal premise, but there are exceptions in this particular market. It's not going to work here for these reasons. And this is the result that we could get if you gave us the discount. So anyway, we rehearsed it and we went back and they did it again. And they came back a few weeks later and said, we got our discount. We got our 7%.
Yahoo! So a little bit of practice and forethought up front on the approach paid dividend.
So, I mean, if you apply all this to knowledge management, it's very much about building up tacit knowledge of things which are tacit, things which are under the surface, part of the team dynamic that is blocking progress, and visualizing it, because we can visualize it, nice, colorful, diagrams and graphs. And when they see that, the knowledge, it's put on the table. And okay, well, we didn't realize that this was going on under the surface. We now realize that it's something that's been affecting us. We can see what the problem is. Let's manage it. So in a way, it is a type of knowledge management, a knowledge management of deep dynamics that are going on under the surface, which could be blocking progress.
You're bringing up the favorite leg of knowledge management for me, which is people. Out of the three, people, process, and technology, people, I think, is where the effort never seems to really be put forth in a true sense of a culture approach. And I think what you do is exactly that.
Thanks.
So thank you, Michael, and thank you for being here. Any last words?
If you don't change things, things won't change.
And, so profound.
Well, I don't know. But I mean, if you don't change things about yourself, as I said before, I'm not meaning that changing you as a person, but changing what you do in particular contexts. And I think that applies to all people-related things.
If your company or organization would like to help us continue this mission and sponsor one of our shows, email byntk@pioneer-ks.org. You have just finished our latest Because You Need to Know, a public service of Pioneer Knowledge Services. Please join us on LinkedIn and find us at pioneer-ks.org.